Every year, Universal Newsreels would produce a summary newsreel, all the major events that took place that year. This is the one for 1964.
1964 was a year that saw the rise and fall of national leaders around the world. Once again, the strength of democratic processes was demonstrated in the United States as the Republicans and the Democrats fought it out for the presidency. Mr. Johnson was thrust into office through the tragedy in Dallas. Now he sought to become president in his own right, and he was opposed by Republican Barry Goldwater in a hot and heavy political campaign. The loudest voice of all was the quiet American voter. When the ballots were counted, President Johnson had a plurality of 16 million, and a landslide vote returned him to office with Hubert Humphrey as his vice president. In Britain, the voters there ended a 13-year Conservative Party rule, and Lord Hume was forced to resign as Prime Minister. The Labourites took over at number 10 Downing Street as Harold Wilson became the new Prime Minister. Khrushchev joined the Outs, but of course he was bounced from office. The people had no voice in that matter. However, Nikita was always in full voice. When he visited the United Nations, his harangue left the delegates aghast. The Central Committee pulled the red carpet from beneath Khrushchev and named Leonid Brezhnev as new party leader. A towering figure passed from the world scene. Nehru became India's first prime minister when it won independence from Britain, and he led his country to new greatness. He was respected by world leaders, and his influence was vast. India's flag of freedom is lowered as millions jam New Delhi to mourn their beloved prime minister. He is accorded a Hindu funeral that calls for cremation. He left an indelible record on the pages of history. Death claimed the man who has been called one of the greatest military geniuses of all time. General Douglas MacArthur was idolized on his recall from the Korean front, and he was universally mourned when death claimed the old soldier who had captured popular imagination. His wife and son led dignitaries at a state funeral as the nation said farewell. Herbert Clark Hoover became 31st president in 1929, overcame the derision of being the Depression president, and was consultant to his successors. A grateful nation accorded Mr. Hoover a state funeral with his body resting in the rotunda of the Capitol. His was a notable record of public service. Historical precedent was shattered in 1964 when Pope Paul VI visited the Holy Land. He received an overwhelming reception as he retraced the steps of Jesus Christ along the Via Dolorosa. He visited the Sea of Galilee, where Christ had chosen Peter as the first pontiff. Later in the year, the teeming millions of India flocked to Bombay to greet the Burra Guru, the great holy man. Never in India had there been such a demonstration for a Christian leader. The United States increased its aid to South Vietnam. Political uncertainty there continued to hamper the war against the Viet Cong rebels. For the first time, helicopters proved their worth as a combat weapon. In South Vietnam, they were used for observation, for strafing the enemy, and for penetrating jungle areas with combat troops. The efficiency of the Vietnam soldiers did not extend to the government. At year's end, there was another upheaval as a group of military commanders ousted the civilian government. It was a move that met with immediate disapproval from the United States. There were a lot of loudmouth dames roaming the eastern seaboard, and the loudest was Hurricane Hilda. It covered an area of 70,000 miles at one time, with winds of 150 miles an hour, raging from Nag's Head on Carolina's Outer Banks to Mount Desert in Maine. Alaska was shaken by the greatest earthquake ever recorded on the North American continent. Great crevasses opened in the earth and literally swallowed everything. Property damage exceeded $500 million. The Alaskan pioneers quickly rebuilt. A bright chapter in the course of human events was written with the passage of the Civil Rights Bill. It was an historic occasion that Lincoln's dream of equality came to fruition at the White House as President Johnson signed it into law just a few hours after the House had approved the measure. Before a distinguished audience of legislators and civil rights leaders, President Johnson affixes his signature using more than 100 pens. One of the coveted souvenirs goes to the Nobel Prize winner, Martin Luther King, a dedicated leader of his race. A mighty new voice was heard in space as an Atlas carries Ranger 7 into orbit and on its way to the moon. It was the most successful probe in the history of the space race, as Ranger sends back more than 4,000 pictures. These pictures carried man across new thresholds in space. 1964 will go down in history as the year of the fair, the New York World's Fair, of course, the greatest exhibit of its kind ever staged. The symbolic Unisphere was the mecca of millions who came to gaze in wonder at more than 200 pavilions, pavilions that became fairyland palaces at night. Yes, there were plenty of fireworks during 1964. It was a year of change, a year that called upon man to face new challenges, to shape the world he dreams about.